Hi, folks. I'm Glenn Lane. I'm the lead pastor of Community Baptist Church in Fallbrook, California. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the evidence for the early date of the Gospels. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this, but I'm going to stick to two concepts that help us to realize that the Gospels must have been composed at a very early date. Those two I call the two dogs that didn't bark. There's a story called Silver Blaze. It's a Sherlock Holmes story by Arthur Conan Doyle. It's the story of the disappearance of a racehorse. It is believed that a stranger stole the horse, but Holmes is able to pin the horse's disappearance on the horse's late trainer, a man by the name of John Straker. The reason? A dog at the horse's stable did not bark on the night of the disappearance of the horse. The dog would have barked if a stranger had taken the horse. The fact that he didn't directed Holmes toward the horse having been taken by someone he was familiar with. Sometimes the absence of something is as compelling as it being present. There's a long-standing assumption that by many that our four Gospels were written very late, generations after the events. If you go to a typical secular historical account of the Gospels, they'll often cite dates around 120 A.D. Now, that's long enough that they would be useless as historical documents. But there are at least two dogs that didn't bark, which undermine the idea of late dating the Gospels. The first non-barking dog has to do with the death of the Apostle Paul. Now, we know from many sources that Paul was known as the founder of many churches in the Roman world, as the writer of several New Testament letters, and as a martyr during the time of Nero. These stories were well known in early Christian times. Nero reigned from 54 to 68 A.D. Many sources tell us that his persecution of believers greatly intensified after the Great Fire of Rome that occurred in July of 64 A.D. Roman historian Tacitus tells us that Nero blamed the fire on the Christians in Rome. Not surprisingly, 64 A.D., using strictly Christian sources, is also the year that Paul was beheaded by Nero. Well, here's the dog that didn't bark. Much of the book of Acts takes place describing the ministry of Paul, but it ends with Paul alive and well under house arrest in Rome. In that account in the book of Acts, there's no hint of a systematic persecution of Christians in Rome. Surely an account of Paul's ministry, written long after the events, would have included his death, the dramatic conclusion to the story. The logical conclusion was that Paul was still alive when the book of Acts was written. That's the straightforward reading of the book. Now, this has dramatic consequences for the dating of the Gospels. Acts is clearly the second volume of a two-part work on Jesus and the early church. Both of these books are addressed to someone named Theophilus. Acts even mentions the previous work, which we call the Gospel of Luke. So if you have Acts conclude by 62 A.D. or so, that means that Luke is earlier, 60 to 61 A.D. But as they say on TV, wait, there's more. The New Testament scholars of all stripes agree that Luke in part bases his gospel on two earlier works from which he draws from selectively. The first is the Gospel of Mark. The second is a collection of sayings that is often referred to as Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. Matthew also uses material from Q, and we know this because Matthew and Luke have sections that are virtually identical word for word. All this pushes the dating of Mark back to sometime before 60 A.D. Not an uncommon guess is 55 A.D. Now, 55 A.D. is 25 years after the events of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It is, for our sake, it is from this year, it'd be like events from 1994. Fairly recent as things go. An early date like that's very important. Late date advocates say that a late date is needed for the passing of eyewitnesses so that you could have the development of a cloud of legend surrounding the events of the Gospels. However, its early date, there's lots of living eyewitnesses to the events who could refute such legendary material. Anyone who's ever looked into how legends develop agree that you need the passage of a considerable period of time for non-historical legends to arise. They do not arise in a month or in a year or in a decade, and sometimes you need the better part of a century for a myth to arise. That's the dog that didn't bark. That's the first one. No mention of the death of Paul in the book of Acts, an important element in making a case for the early date of the Gospels. Now, the second dog that didn't bark is that there's no discussion of circumcision in the Gospels. Now, let me explain. The book of Acts and the letters of Paul both reflect, and a lot of non-biblical sources too, that a controversial item in the early church was, do Gentile converts to faith in Christ need to be circumcised? Because after all, that is something that was commanded to the Jewish people in the Old Testament, and aren't they really just kind of joining our Messianic Judaism? Big hot issue. Acts 15 actually describes a major meeting of leaders in the early church, and their meeting is about this issue: to what degree do Gentile converts have to conform to the particulars of Jewish law in terms of diet, kosher versus non-kosher, and circumcision. As they got together, and Acts 15 describes, basically the verdict was not at all. I mean, a little bit of consideration to Jewish neighbors and so forth, but no longer something that they would expect Gentiles to do. Now, I want you to imagine for a minute that the Gospels were not written when I'm saying they were written, namely in the 50s, 60s, probably the Gospel of John maybe as late as about 90 AD, but instead they were written 40 years after that. Enough time for, like I said, for legend to arise. It is hard to imagine that a story in which Jesus makes a pronouncement about circumcision would not have been created by the church and put into a gospel like that. You know what's really interesting about this is that the Gospel of Mark does contain a story in which Jesus makes a pronouncement about kosher food. Mark chapter 7 basically says, and he declared all things clean. Why don't we have something like that about circumcision? Because circumcision was at least as hot an item as kosher food was in the early church. Back when I was in seminary, the late Dr. David Scholler said to me that the lack of teaching on the part of Jesus on the subject of circumcision was, in his mind, the single most compelling piece of evidence, not only for an early date of the Gospels, but the overall historical reliability of the Gospels. The death of Paul and the lack of teaching from John on circumcision are two very compelling, non-barking dogs that are important parts of the puzzle in establishing that Gospels were written very early by eyewitnesses or associates of eyewitnesses. These quiet dogs move us away from the view of the Gospels as embellished legend toward the direction of Gospels as reliable history. And you really don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to realize how important that is. Thanks for listening.